Hello and welcome to my TED Talk. My name is Les, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about me in a moment. The agenda, or what the focus is on users. The idea comes from the fact that I spend a lot of time in the Discords and some of the other stuff, where I do a lot of work with SPAD.next. That's what I use to integrate my sim. And whether it's SPAD or AAO or FSUIPC, one of the things is tough with Flight Sim and FSX and P3D is knowing what do you use, what do you play with, and how is it that you know to do this? People always be like, how did you figure this out? And it's like, oh, I guess there's something to talk about. So when I was asked, would I talk? I said, oh, that's a cool thing. I can try that, and we'll see where it goes. So about me. I didn't get into Flight Sim until 2015, and it was because a buddy of mine, who at the time was a captain on the E190, took me into a sim session in a CAE sim in Toronto. And that was so good. So the next day, my sim journey began. So I walked into Canada Computers, and I bought every SciTech thing that they had in 2015. And I'm sure I'm one of them. I'm one of the many. And you know, you built it on a desk, and then you start cutting panels out and mounting something in the living room, and then your significant other's like, really? Yeah. But luckily that room is in a place where it's not really accessible. It's downstairs. It's not where the kitchen is. It's not where the bathroom is. So she kind of let me go. Also, it was there before she moved in. So now, just for clarity, I do fly planes, and I got an instrument rating, all because of this journey. The journey just snowballed and kept going. And I think what's really neat is I know a lot of people who are pilots, and they usually have weird things about sims. I love Flight Sim. I come back to it every week. Doesn't matter if I go flying a regular plane. Flight Sim is just, it's awesome. It's really sad that I found it in 2015. So many of these guys are awesome. They're like, I started in '99. I'm like, damn it, I missed this. So what is SimConnect, and why as a user should I understand it? So I'm sure some of you are going to be like, okay, I already know this. Sorry, I'm trying to make sure that anyone coming along understands why. So it started with FSX. Actually, I think it was in even 2004. Again, I wasn't around then. But with FSX and then P3D and Microsoft, they use the SimConnect interface. And it's used by other sims as well, right? SimConnect allows you a bidirectional interface, meaning you can send stuff in from the outside world, and you can pull data out of it from the outside world. Very helpful because I'm sure a lot of you have seen, we're limited directly in the sim with all the things we can interact with, right, for firing off buttons and events. What's also really nice about SimConnect is it is networkable. So yes, you can run the applications and the interfaces directly on the same machine, the same PC. And nowadays, I mean, what are we, 32 threads, 16 cores, 32 threads. Like, people have enough processing that it's not a huge deal. But if you start getting more complex, or you just enjoy the idea of this is for rendering my sim, and I want all my other data processing to be off board, you can do that because your devices can run on a secondary PC, and it's using SimConnect interface over the network. And it's not hard to do. The biggest problem with that one, and there's already tutorials, and in the SPAD group we've got one, but it's that you just have to go into the SimConnect config file on your local machine and enable it. So a lot of people miss that part, and they get frustrated because they're like, I don't understand. Is it firewalls? Is this? It's like, no, you didn't tell the sim it was allowed to. And you change one thing, and then it's good to go. So very helpful. So what do I do with that? That's what allows me to build application layers as well as interface layers. This is what all of us, I'm sure, use either FSUIPC, AAO, Mobiflight, SPAD.next. They're all that application layer that then interfaces. But also, you're going to find from a lot of vendors, they also create their own, right? So they're going to install these things because that's how they then connect their hardware device into the sim, especially those that need lights to light up or numbers to display, right? It's not so bad when you just want to fire events in because you can make a HID device and make it super simple. It's when you want to pull the data out. So as you start getting into the volume product market, so meaning products that sell at volume and they want to create a plug and play world, so a lot of people will buy it, plug it in, and it should just work. And then, of course, we'll talk about add-ons and how it breaks. The other thing, though, that happens with that is you're now running all of these interfaces, right? And SimConnect, you are polling it. So when you're updating this data, SimConnect is polling, right? It's not just a fire and forget. It's not like it's just UDP and every message is being sent out. You're subscribing to SimVars, and that subscription is on a polling. So every device you add is actually going to be interfacing with your Sim. Now, sidebar, some people will argue against this. I don't care. I have it from a few other people that are the experts on it. Having your plugin right into the exe XML file so that it launches with the Sim is very, very bad because it's going to go in the same time slices. And already you're not a multi-threaded app with the Flight Sim, so it's going to run on the same main thread. And that's why when you expand Flight Sim, you're going to see all of these other applications. I would suggest not doing that. Instead, make a batch script that launches everything together for you if you don't want to click them all off, but pull them out, because that way they'll start on their own cores and on their own time slices, and they'll be accessing memory, and they will not cause a problem with your main thread. So anyway, there's a whole debate on that one. But doing all this, okay, so SimConnect, it's all about the VARs and events. So that's the important thing to understand. There's VARs and there's events. And there's a lot of VARs. And some of them we can't get access to, and some of them we can't use. There's also plenty that aren't even writable. So there is a wonderful place in the docs.Microsoft Flight Sim. You can go and you can read the SDK. Two places that are very important. One is obviously the simulation variables, and then you can go and find them all. But you have to go to the additional information to the reverse Polish notation, because that's the section that would teach a developer how to write reverse Polish notation, which breaks my brain because the operators and the numbers, and it hurts, but you sit there for hours staring at it. But what was important is they've listed off all of the VARs and events and where they sit and where they come from. So VARs, so when we're breaking it down for the VARs, an AVAR is the standard VAR. When they talk about standard SimVars, or somebody says the term AVAR, this is what they're referring to. These are the core simulation variables that the Sim runs on. And this is also why you run into a problem where you're like, oh, why isn't this developer using the standard VARs and then my panel will just work? Well, they can't, because they need to apply, it could be N1, for example. Their engine N1 is not modeled. That engine is not modeled, right? That turboprop model is not modeled. So in the cockpit, they're going to have to take that VAR and they're going to like trick you, because they have to write the value that would be realistic to the plane while dealing with what the simulation core runs as that engine. So they can't always use an AVAR, but those are the ones that you generally want to try to work with. Bs, some people will call it BVAR, it's an input event. That was the new thing that they introduced. What was it, software SU5, so that Xbox ran better. That's the one that's the biggest problem, because we have no way to connect to those. And a lot of these other devs have some beta stuff going where they're injecting into it, or you hook up LVARs to the BVAR and then you have to run a script that copies it across. The more LVARs you write, the more you hurt the Sim performance. LVARs are very Sim intensive, hence why they moved to the B event system instead of having lots of extra LVARs. So we're hoping to have that resolved and have a build that will solve that from SPAD. I know AAO also had something working recently. So other ones that are important to us, you're going to have the H events, the I events, and the K events. Then we've also got the LVARs. These are the ones that you'll hear lots of all through the days of FSX, P3D, and even Microsoft Flight Sim. This is how the developers get to inject their own variables when they launch their Sim object. And then this is a way for us to manipulate and work with those planes. And that's the ones where we get into the biggest problem with standard interfaces that will only do standard events because why doesn't it work with my PMDG? Or why doesn't it work with SWS's plane? Which we're going to cover how we do that with those planes, and hopefully you'll like it. There's even ZVARs, which are custom SimVARs as well. And these also can get injected. What's cool about these ones is they are very specific about you definitely cannot name it the same. So when a developer is adding this, they cannot name it the same as an AVAR because they will conflict. And that's good because you are allowed to do direct injection with ZVARs. So if you know what those variables are and they publish them in a list, you can actually add them through most of the software where you type in what the command is, and now that software will be able to send it, right? So they can mostly direct inject those. There's very few that use ZVARs because they all stick to LVARs. Okay, so LVARs. They are going to be one of the top things that we interface with. One of the coolest things that they've done for us, the cockpit building, whether it's the big cockpits or little cockpits, LVARs can actually go through SimConnect now. So with SU12, they did add that LVAR support. In P3D and FSX, you still need a bridge module, similar to what you're going to need for H events, which we'll cover as well. This stuff is really neat because as they're adding this, it does show us. I know some people complain. They're like, oh, does Microsoft really care about us? I think they do because they wouldn't be putting this type of support directly into SimConnect if they didn't care about helping us configure our hardware and run our PCs. So it's there. So SimVARs is the data, and this is the place where I usually have people that run into the hardest problem because when you read some of the RPN script out of files or you see what people have posted, it may reference some AVARs, and so people try to just write that AVAR. And so you really need to look at the documentation, and this is just a quick snippet, right? I just grabbed a page. The reason why you need to look at it in all those lists of VARs is there's a lot of VARs that are not writable. The VAR is not writable. Then you do have some VARs which are writable. But if you write that variable, it may get written right back. And that's because the plane might be holding its own OVARs. And so in their own gauges, they might hold its own dedicated variable. I should have backed up, sorry. Any of the letters, think of them like a prefix in a telephone number. It's like the area code, right? So you're prefixing it because when it gets sent in, that's how the protocol decodes it, right? It's just for parsing. I guess I should have mentioned that, sorry. But there are these OVARs which get held in gauges, so like the plane itself directly in its code. Again, that way it doesn't write it in and out of the sim and tie it up. It's like, oh, this is logic somebody shouldn't want to use, except for us because we want to program panels. So realistically, what you want to always be trying to do is trigger events. Okay? So, and the events that are most important to us are B events, which we currently can't access, but they're like the holy grail because now that's literally moving the switch in the plane in Microsoft Flight Sim. So if we can now directly say, this switch is what I want to move, then it'll fire off all their code and you don't have to worry about what events do I have to trigger, which we'll cover. There's times where we have to do two things. The H event, or the HTML events, these are all built for the JS HTML gauges, all brand new with Microsoft Flight Sim. And you cannot trigger them through SimConnect. You have to build a WASM bridge, so that goes into the community folder, and that is now how you can direct inject H events. H events also don't announce, so if you're firing things off in the plane, you cannot use data monitors and see them. They're only accessible within it. So you have to know those and know how to find them. But don't worry, we're going to cover how to do that. Finally, the good old K events or key events. That's your standard sim event. When somebody says send the standard sim event, use the standard commands, that's what a K event is. And it's a keyboard event because that's also like everything in the Microsoft bindings. Those are key events. It's what you map to keyboard key bindings, and those would be your standard events. So there's also that wonderful list of events. If you're trying to figure something out, go to that website, hit Control F, and you can search on stuff like fuel, and then you're gonna find all the fuel vars, and then you can click through all of those different types of events to get in and find them, right? That's one way of going about it, because you may not have the tools to pull out event monitoring. But it's a great way to figure out, I'm trying to do something with the fuel system, here are all the events available to me. Okay, there's fuel pumps, there's fuel switches. Which one, if I send that command, does the plane actually activate with? So, moving on to a simple explanation of how that kind of works. So we're gonna go real simple. There's kind of three ways the autopilots work in Microsoft Flight Sim currently, because you have the super stock basic thing. This is the same as FSX, same as P3D. Basically, you press that nav button on the autopilot, it sends the K event into the sim core. It processes and churns on it, tells the plane what to do and what it needs to do, and then out the other side, it spits out the updates to all the data vars. So again, having this kind of visual aid, you can see why trying to trigger and set the AVAR on the other side of the core isn't going to do what you want, because it might switch it right back. It doesn't understand it. It's not going to update the sim because it's not intended to be written that way. But we want that data because we want to turn those LED lights on that are on our panels. So great. Standard event. If I take that SciTech, Logitech, multi-panel, and I plug it in and I use their plug-in, everything that works with standard events works like this. And so the light comes on, life is great, life is easy. But of course, that autopilot's pretty rudimentary. If I hit the nav button, it doesn't arm nav mode, right? When we use the older iterations of the Garmin's or the older things before the devs have come along, you'd hit nav and it just instantly turn and fly on nav, as opposed to arming nav mode and you having to intercept your course. It works, and for some people, they actually complained when people made it work the correct way, because they were like, why isn't it following my magenta line? Well, you didn't intercept it. So how third parties had to do it. Now, this is not what they have to do now, but if I'm working in P3D still, or I'm working in FSX, this is how those third parties would do it. And even a great example was the working title CJ4 when it was a mod, before they began work on the core, which we'll cover next. So this is the part of why those panels can't work with standard vars. Because they want, when I hit the nav button, I want to arm nav mode, because I still have to fly and intercept it, and then when I'm on the intercept, then it will activate and it will grab the line. So you can't send the standard event, because the standard event is going to hit the sim core, and it's just going to turn on nav mode. Because the reality is, most of these third parties are running the sim, running the autopilot in like a heading or a roll mode, right? They're not running the core in nav mode because they're calculating and doing all of their own. That way you can have radius to fixes, right? You can have all the different leg types that the sim doesn't natively support. So what they do is they have you change LVARs, or in the case of PMDG, which by the way, still one of the best SDKs ever, as long as you read it, they use the rotor brake command. And with what they're doing is they're effectively, every switch gets a number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to the thousands. And then what they tag onto it is a value. 1 is on, 0 is off. And in their SDK, they have something for every event, like I'm scroll wheel rolling, or I'm left clicking, or I'm right clicking. So the concept with how you can interact with it through the SDK is, how would I do it in the cockpit with my mouse? Great. In the drop-down, I can select that in SPAD, and it will roll the switch, it will click the switch, it'll do those things, right? So PMDG, it's great. They carried it forward into Microsoft Flight Sim. It may seem weird because it's, if you were looking at an event monitor, it's just nonstop rotor brakes. But when you import the SDK and that software supports it directly, like SPAD does, what ends up happening is it just becomes an event list and you see the actual name, like MCP heading mode. So it's real easy to figure out what switches, what buttons, and what you're doing. When Working Title modded the CJ4, right, they replaced all the buttons with H events because everything in the CJ4 is this new HTML, JavaScript, coherent stuff, right? It's not using the old XML gauges that we had in FSX and P3D. It's all new. It's also why none of the Garmin G1000 events that we had from before work. It's why a bunch of the camera events don't work. There's a bunch of events that don't work because they were deprecated because it's a whole new system. And that is where these H events come in, but you have to know them. And what's nice, Working Title published it on their webpage. They're like, hey, here's the docs. This is the button we're pressing. And so they were doing the same thing, is you were pressing this thing that told their custom autopilot. By the way, do you like that the third party is like spinning? Because it's like they're spinning plates. But they're processing this and figuring out and doing their own autopilot code, but they're keeping the sim in heading mode. And then this is also why people had problems with their Honeycomb Bravos. They're like, I don't understand. I switched the knob and now the CJ4 thinks it's in nav mode, but it turns out it's following my heading bug. It's like, well, because under the hood it was actually in heading and you now just told the sim directly because you weren't using the H events, right? So that's why they had said, okay, you have to disable all those buttons. You can't use them. You have to click in the cockpit. Or you use one of the pieces of software that we've mentioned, which can interface with that hardware, and now you can send these events. So those events come out. Of course, it sets the heading lock LVAR. So again, people are like, I'm in nav mode. Why is my SciTech panel saying I'm in heading mode? Well, because under the hood, you're in heading mode. Because then they do their own data processing, and out the other side comes a whole bunch of LVARs. So you see on the inbound side, like the Aerosoft CRJ, the way Hans does all of his planes, same thing with the ATR, love it. It's all LVAR based. Even the switches, they're all LVARs. So there's an LVAR, you set it, you turn it off, it does the thing. That's how he does it. PMDG uses a K event. They use the rotor brake, they take over the rotor brake, and they just inject all these numbers. Working Title, use the H events. But coming out the other side, they all have to be LVARs. So that plane has its own dedicated data. It's an LVAR. You read the LVAR, you can now turn on the light. But you can't do that with the standard interfaces. Now, how has it changed with Microsoft? This is also another thing that I think is really cool. So Working Title with, it was in SU5 when they started the G1000. They introduced a new avionics managed mode. So what happens is whenever you use one of their planes or you use TDS's GTN, it uses the mode, the G3000s. What happens is that they now can tell the sim, the autopilot, you're not paying attention to it anymore. I'm now in control. And so now instead of having to go through like a roundabout way, instead, they kind of got this barrier. They intercept these events. And now they redirect those events into their big brain, which processes it, and then they disconnected the AVARs. So this mode disconnected the AVAR from the autopilot. Before, you couldn't say, well, put it in roll mode, but set the AVAR. Because remember, the AVARs are like, nope, 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 you can't set this. So in this mode, the AVAR is not set by the actual SIM core. It's actually set by their big brain on the left-hand side of the core, goes in, and now it comes out with standard VARs. So the G1000s, the G3000s, now the Boeings, right, that they just did in AAU2, all of those are actually able to work with that standard software. So the standard events will light up and it will work. You don't have to go into the world of LVARs. So they're doing a really nice thing. Now, I do this just for fun because in the G1000, they don't intercept TOGA. And that's a running joke for me. I'm dying for them to finish it. But this is the only one that slips by. And so if you're flying a G1000 and you hit TOGA, the flight director goes up, wings go level, but the modes don't change because it's running it in pitch and roll under the hood, right? Their whole autopilot system runs the plane in pitch and roll, which is perfect, except for when you hit toga and you got to remember, oh, I gotta toggle the mode back because it thinks it's in control, but you've actually directly told the sim under the hood, nope, pitch up and just go. So hopefully they don't kill me for mentioning that again. All right, so ideally with all this hardware, those of us who add panels and buy more stuff, what is desired is how can we control this, right? Well, first off, there is a free data tool. So there is a sim watcher that they supply. So again, within the SDK world, down the side of the panel over here, you'll find the sim watcher. It's not an exe that you download, it's VS Code. So you have to install VS Code, which isn't a bad thing. VS Code is really good for looking at a lot of the panel config files because of how it presents it to you. But hey, maybe it'll get you down the path of being interested in maybe looking at building some software yourself. You have to compile it and then it'll run. So it would be cool if they just supplied the compiled version, but it is there, so I highly recommend it. I use SPAD.next. I have since 2015 because same problem. I had these SciTech panels and I couldn't control PMDG, I couldn't control Carenado, I couldn't control any of the planes that I bought and added on because they all had LVARs and custom events. And same thing when I migrated to P3D, right? I couldn't control them. So there's two pieces to it. It has a data monitor, works very much the same. You pick from a list the data, because again, just like the sim watcher, you're subscribing to the data and then it's updating. So as changes happen to the data, it will update in the sim, or in the lists of stuff. The event monitor was something that they have that I really like. So the event monitor, you can enable the event monitor, and as you press things in the cockpit, if it is using standard events, it's using K events, because remember, H events can't broadcast, it'll show you. So it really helps. It may not be what you want to use because it might be a set event with a value because the cockpit, right, is maintaining its logic, and then it says, oh, set it directly to a value. But it allows you to go back to that list and be like, what I want is increment and decrement on my knob. I'm not trying to set it to 288, set it to 289. So I want increment and decrement. But in that list of events that we saw earlier that you can easily access and reference, you'll find those events. Or if you're using SPAD, it's in the dropdown, so you'll see them. All right, examples. This is the biggest thing. It's like, how did you find that switch? How did you find that variable? How did you know to look for that? So a few of us get that a lot in the different discords. How did you do this? It's like, okay, we haven't ever explained to people some of what we do. So first off, my favorite, go download their manuals, because guess what? Some of them are really good about it. So for example, the SWS RV-14. Love the plane. Thought it was hilarious because Flight Shops is here this week. So that plane in the manual document has its switch bindings. And they literally tell us what their custom switches are. What is the LVAR? Now with SPAD, sure, I can pull in the LVAR list because it has a thing for, hey, grab LVARs from the plane, you see them. Some of the other software doesn't have it. You have to know it, right? Well, it's not hard to find if they publish it. What you don't have here, though, is a list of the rest of the switches. So yeah, SimWorks Studios has at least helped us with the non-standard stuff, but they haven't helped us with stuff that falls under standard. Okay, so let's use the master aux battery. Well, what's great is I fire up the event monitor and I move that switch. And all of those commands come flying out. So you know right away, if I was trying to do that in the Microsoft bindings, it wasn't going to work because it's going to keep setting it back, which it does. That was because, as they showed you in their document, they use an LVAR. And so if you don't change the value of that LVAR, they have update code, and that update code just says, nope, set it back, set it back, set it back, set it back. So it's a little bit of trial and error, but you will figure it out. So it's great. We can look up in the list. We can find all these different battery events. We could try different ones. And you do. And I can tell you right now, none of them are going to work. But We already knew that because we referenced the document, right? I'm giving you the document up front so that we're not like blind leading the blind. Obviously, Les, you already told us by showing us the document, right? But I didn't know that, or they didn't have it, and this is a way of trying it. So all of a sudden, you go and you map. Fine, I'm going to do that same thing I saw in the event monitor. I'm going to map master battery set. I'm going to set a value of 1. That should work, right? Nope, doesn't work. Okay, if they didn't have that document, how would have I found this out? Again, sure, something like SPAD, we can do it with a tool that sucks in the data and presents it to us. Nice and easy. If I don't have that, another really important way is dev mode. So everybody has access to, well, unless you're on Xbox, everybody has access to dev mode, right? You just go into the settings, turn on dev mode. The behaviors drop-down is really, really useful. The problem is you have to know this, right? Somebody has had to tell you. Some of us figured it out, some have to tell you. In every plane, the most important document are these interior XML files. So if the plane isn't encrypted, so it's not from the marketplace, it isn't encrypted, you can always jump in and just open up that file, search for the switch, and it's going to give you all that information. But if it's encrypted, you can't. This is the way you can bypass that, though. So you can load this up, you can go to the interior XML, and those are just drop-downs. So they have their different sections, switches, throttles, whatever they've named inside of their plane. And then inside of that, I can find that switch, that 2-battery switch. And then I find the code that's running. It'll tell you this is what's updating, or with H events, this is the H event it's sending. So there is a very methodical way, I don't want to say easy, it kind of is easy once you've done it a few times, but it's very methodical. It's very easy to locate it and find it. But this is exactly the example I wanted to illustrate of why sending the K events isn't going to work. It's running update code, so this code is always running in a loop, and it's tracking that LVAR. So all those OVARs, right? So you have the switch state with the OVAR, that stuff we can't access. What we can access is the LVARs. If we don't set the LVAR, anything you try to do to the sim, it's going to set it back. It's going to set it back, right? So unless you click it with a mouse, which sets the LVAR, or you set the LVAR, it ain't going to switch. So that's very important. On the right-hand side of the screen is that if I have access to the files because they're not encrypted, there's an example of using VS Code, use Notepad++, use a text file. The reason why I use VS Code is you see it's color-coded. It structures it, it knows how to structure the XML. And then you do the same thing. I just searched for battery, and it's going to find, of course, all the places with battery, and you're going to come down, and you're going to find the one that says, the battery is this LVAR. So if I set that LVAR, the battery is going to work. Of course, what I really like about what they did, they gave us all those LVARs up front, right? But this is kind of a process explanation. You're going to run into planes that don't do that. There are vendors that don't supply those LVARs. You got to go find them.
Okay, so to be clear, first you go to the behaviors section in depth.
You don't, sorry. You could do this and do this all day long and never do the thing on the right. This is available whether the plane is encrypted or not. The thing on the right is if the plane isn't encrypted, so like I didn't buy it in the marketplace, I bought it outside, I can open the file directly. And then I'm not having to click through drop-downs and click through things. I can just do a quick search, and sometimes I find it easier to read, right, than in there.
Okay, but it's just when you bring up the screen, it's just in there. You don't have to actually activate the switch with the mouse.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. It's all in there. Same thing with the document, right? They're all listed. So the question was, do you do it first or do you do it second? And you could just always do dev mode, or you can open the XML if it's available. So now that we've mapped the switch, right, using those LVARs, because I searched under LVAR and I found the battery, and now I've gone and I've mapped it, now I can see. So in the data monitor, in SPAD, I can pull all the LVARs, then I'm going to search, so I filter it down. I'm going to grab those so that they populate inside of the monitor, and now I'm just switching the switch inside of the plane, and I'm watching which one of those LVARs referencing battery move. That's the easiest way to find it. But you have to be in SPAD.next. You might be in AAO, you might be in Mobiflight, you might be in FSUIPC. I don't know how those have event monitors or how those work, because I've always used this. I'm just using this as the example, but I wanted to also show people how you can do it directly. Dev mode, read the XML, or through event monitors that parse LVARs, you can just pull it in. So there's a lot of ways to skin the cat, and that's kind of just what I was trying to present. So once you've gone and you've figured out what it is, then you're going to set up your switch or your toggle button to set that LVAR. Set it to a 0, set it to a 1, or toggle it. Yay! I can now control the battery. It's wonderful. Whole new world.
The variability, the differences between how the different buttons work, different switches.
Yes.
Is that due to a different programmer, a different version of the software, and they did it one way or the other way?
So,
or is there a logic as to this kind of switch, I want this sort of behavior, this is the way this is going to work, and then you know or have a better idea as to whether the LVAR is the way.
so the question is there a reasoning or is there a standard, or why do they do switches differently with LVARs or other things? I got to repeat it for the online. Sorry. Yes. So part of it is like the battery. If that wasn't a 3-position switch, they could use the standard VARs because it has an on and an off, right? So the standard VARs for a lot of those switches and a lot of the standard events, they don't have the concept of 3 positions. So that's why usually 3-position switches end up in LVARs, or they end up in B events, the new stuff that's B events. And there, for example, we could use the inertial separator in the TBM.
So this gives you an idea of some advanced logic saying, if it switches behaving like this, I know I'm not going to be able to do that. I got to look at this.
And that's where the event monitor comes in pretty handy, is because there'll be times where you don't see anything in the event monitor. So again, it depends on how flipping that switch, they interact with the sim. Do they actually send a K event, or is it certain stuff that you can set VARs with? So there are VARs, like we said, go look at the doc. There are VARs that can be written. So like battery on, like the battery state, you can actually set that VAR and it will write the AVAR. So if they wrote the AVAR, I wouldn't see any switches in the event monitor. So then I would jump into the data monitor and I'd go pull in as many battery data VARs as I could find, and I'd go. Lots of planes, that's why the scraping of the LVARs is very important, because you hit that button and right away, LVARs only load in when the plane is loaded in. So that's the other thing. People sometimes will be like, hey, I tried mapping the stuff that you did, and I tried doing this. I don't see any of this. And it's like, you're in the sim running with the plane loaded, right? No. You have to do that? Oh, darn it. It's like, you know how sometimes you're like, I just assumed you were, and now we're 20 minutes into a back and forth, and I'm like, oh man, go all the way back to the beginning. Start it up, you'll get it. So yes, the data monitors are super helpful because you'll see all those LVARs pop up, right? That you can scrape those. Whereas the H events are the biggest problem, you have to know them. So great, awesome. We moved on to the next switch. Sure enough, they have a alternator switch, right? Cool. Then we move on, and same thing. We could go ahead, we could pop in, we can see that it's a B event. But luckily, when we start looking at it, and this is where, when you can access the document, it gets even better, but you will find it in there because it is telling you that it's using a template. So those are the standard Asobo templates. Everything is inherited. So a lot of times we'll see switches and it's a template. Then you have to go into the official folder, into the general, generic, and then you can find all the templates, and then you can see what events they trigger. So there is a way to backtrack a lot of it. It just takes time. So again, really helpful. You turn on the event monitor, you see that, oh, a normal altimeter event is fired. I'm going to try those. And oh, good, or altimeter, alternator. Oh, good, the standard alternator event worked. But they didn't document that. So that's sometimes with certain things, it's like, oh man, you put custom bindings in, but you didn't tell me every switch in the cockpit, what does what, and what uses what, and it's hard, right? So great, we go off, we found toggle alternator, we set that, we put it on a button, and sure enough, boom, switch is moving up and down. Great, I'm pushing a button, I'm toggling the alternator, and their switch moves because the switch is going to track the standard AVAR. Oh, great. So to your example, why on that one did they use a standard AVAR as a reference? Because it's an on and off, and that's a Boolean, it's a 0 or a 1. So hey, we're set, right? So as we move along the switches, so again, I'm not going to go through each one because we kind of now have an idea of how this works. Well, sure, that one is an LVAR they supplied, the PMAG is, the avionics are. We figured out fuel pump because we just toggled the pump on and off and we watched in the event monitor, it went, great. What the heck is electrical circuit toggle? So, another great thing about Microsoft Flight Sim, they put in all of these electrical circuits, right? You have all kinds of circuit breakers in some of the planes, and really, the Autopilot master button in the RV14 is effectively a circuit breaker. It's just a manual, right? You have your circuit breaker, but that's what they mapped it to. Now, ironically, it's not in the list, even though in a way it's a little custom, right? That's not normal. There is no Autopilot master button like this. I did ask them if they could add it to the document. I'm sure in an update we'll get it. But the point was, we used the event monitor. We saw that there was an electrical circuit toggling. We went to the list of events, and we found all these new things in the SimConnect list. And sure enough, it's like, okay, how did we do that? Well, we toggled the fuel pump. Great. In the variable, we saw it, so we knew we could use the fuel pump. Well, for the autopilot switch, right, we're toggling it, and it's giving us that electrical circle toggle. What's important is actually the parameter column. So in FSX and P3D, most events didn't have parameters unless it was a value. Very few had them, right? In a lot of the stuff used in Microsoft Flight Sim, they'll insert variables. So great one is on the longitude, for example. You send the toggle battery command, toggle landing lights command. Great one. Toggle landing lights, all 3 go on. But if you send it with a parameter instead of 0, you send it and stick in parameter 1, left goes on. You stick in 2, center goes on. You stick in 3, the right one goes on. How did we know to do this? We had to go looking through this stuff because none of that stuff comes out, and those are, of course, our encrypted planes. Yes, the JSHTML code that they did isn't, but the panel, the interior behavior file is locked. By the way, there is a post on the forums, if you all guys will hit the wish list and add it, is to get them to unlock the behavioral model. We don't need the exterior plane, they can keep that locked, but it'd be nice if the XML file that tells us what all the switches do was unlocked. So we found that out, and we could see that it's parameter 34. So that just tells us, and if we looked in the document, we're gonna find, yeah, it's telling us that it's changing an electrical circuit breaker and it's using 34. And so now you do the same thing. You map, toggle this one, number 34, and all of a sudden the switch moves. So you can spend a lot of time trying to work with these things, right? Real quick.
I'm not sure I understand.
No, not you, Siri. Real quick, the ATR. Love this plane. It was great. I know some people are so hard on it, but I thought it was great. This one was easy because it's all LVARs. So it was real easy. You just hit add LVARs in the data monitor, you move switches, it tells you the value, and then you go and you map those. You just had to know that in some cases, 2 VARs are changing. So sure, some of the buttons are a single event. I'm just setting it to 1. I don't even have to set it back to 0 because they have it that as soon as it hits 1, it triggers the toggle, and then the itself is setting it back to 0. Some of the older stuff, you'd like set it to 1, wait half a second, set it back to 0 to emulate pushing and releasing the button. However, what they do have, for example, on turning a heading knob, is you need to set two things. One is spinning the knob, and the other is telling it, I am changing you, I am changing you, I am changing you. So that's it. Once you've picked up that little nuance, everything is, MSATR, autopilot, heading, button or knob, and you just go through and you rip it out real fast. So heading value, for example. Again, same thing. I want to pull the heading value out so I can display it on my Logitech flight panel or on an MCP. Yeah, LVAR, select, heading. It's easy. Now, one of my favorite planes is the HJet. It uses all H events. We got to go quick because I'm almost over time. Hey, working title, thank you. See, they made it easy. So in their documentation that's on the GitHub, they list every single G3000 event. So you don't have to go and find them and dig in. You will know what every knob does. Same thing on the HJet. But what's really nice, and this is the kind of thing I wish developers would do, they have a posted key bindings document. And it has all the tabs at the bottom with all the different controls and every control listed. And there is a column for if you can map it directly in Microsoft Flight Sim. So to help those that don't use external software, here you go. This is the event. For events that don't exist, like H events, there's a column listed for that. And then on the right, it'll tell you what the H event is. So that's the example of those knobs on the GTCs, right? Or a lot of the buttons on the G1000, you have to use H events. And so, of course, we can map buttons, select those H events, and a lot of the software, AAO, SpadNext, FSUIPC, there are people constantly adding to the lists to help out the community. You download them, you go look at them, and that's all community driven. They get added in, and then, every time there's an update, hey, we got a whole bunch more. This stuff in SPAD doesn't update with an actual software update. Every time it loads up, if there were new updates, it's done in the background. So a lot of people are like, how did this stuff change? I didn't get an update. I'm still on the same version. It's like, well, that data stuff, it sucks in without actually upgrading the application. And you can do this with AAO, because I know you can enter custom stuff as well. You can do it with FSUIPC. There's a user list that you can build. And in SPAD, there's something missing because a developer added something. It's not in the core yet. You can manually add your own events. This is also how you can get to those ZVARs. So if somebody does make a ZVAR, you can actually put it in and set it 1 and 0. So you'd make a command for on and off because you have to set the value of the ZVAR, but it can be done. So the whole point to this is how do I take all these things and make it one interface? And that's where those third-party tools, because a lot of people are like, I don't understand. Why do you use that if these softwares have their own? Well, Logitech and SciTech and Honeycomb, those will not do anything but the standard events with what ships. So right away, I use a Honeycomb Bravo, I use SciTech panels, I use real SimGear panels. Their standard software cannot do a bunch of the stuff. So great, I want one piece of software like SPAD or AAO or whatever that's going to have all of my devices in one place. And then it's achievable. We can finally map our sims. All right, Mobiflight, Sebastian, really nice guy. If you haven't used Mobiflight, give it a try because it's open source. Contribute though, so he'll keep building it. He launched something a while back. It's currently at number 6. If everybody could take the enhanced API access and vote that up, right? This isn't about developers. It's actually about us, the users. If they make B events and these other VARs accessible, it makes all of our mapping lives easier to add controls. And when I posted the screenshot, we had already gone from 11,000 to 1,100 to 1,102. So if you could jack that up, I would appreciate it very much. So.